The album will be released commercially next month. It's time for a look at the business news with Ben Thompson. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Lakshmi. Thanks very much. Yes, we're going to start with news that mobile phones and other high-tech products have helped boost America's imports. That's according to the latest trade numbers that show resilient consumer spending is propping up the US economy. But at what cost? Well, $65 billion. That's how much the country's trade gap has widened in July. That's up by $1.3 billion from the month before. Now, remember, the trade gap is a difference between how much a country imports from abroad versus what it makes in the US and then sells elsewhere via exports. So what exactly does it tell us about the health of the world's largest economy? Let's ask Dr. Harry Broadman, who's former US Assistant Trade Representative and Chief of Staff at the US President's Council of Economic Advisers. Thank you for being with us on BBC News. And talk to me then, what does this tell us? Because it suggests that consumer spending is still pretty resilient right now.
I think it's resilient, but let's be clear that the numbers of 65 billion is actually lower than what most economists had predicted. You know, the average expectation was on the order of 68 billion. I think, frankly, I think this is sort of good news for Mr. Powell and the other global central bank chairs with whom he's meeting now, as we know, in the U.S. at Jackson Hole. I think, the economy is resilient, but it's certainly sort of steady. And I think that's what we're all looking for.
We know around the world that interest rates are rising to try to keep a lid on inflation. Has that been felt in these numbers yet? Or do we expect to see that consumer confidence, consumer spending could take a hit when people start to see that it's costing them more to borrow and to spend?
Well, I suspect the fact that the deficit is slightly narrower than expected is probably because of the impact of higher interest rates. And I think that impact will be felt further as time goes on. It'd be really interesting, obviously, to see what happens next month. Don't forget also, when we looked at the previous numbers in the previous period, they actually were revised lower as a result of this data set announced this morning. So I think, again, there's a relatively smooth trajectory going on here. There's not a lot of big surprises, and I don't think this is a worrying report.
We know that President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is aimed at bringing more production onshore, bringing more jobs back to the United States, particularly around things like infrastructure or green energy. Looking at these figures, though, the trade deficit with China rising once again, rising to 24 billion in July. That's because of more imports. How is that still happening, given all of the rhetoric we've heard from the White House about reducing America's reliance on China?
Well, the deficit did rise with China, but really, again, quite narrowly, 1.2 billion, on a total of 66 billion, that is our deficit with China. And let's also not forget that, these laws, the Inflation Reduction Act and other stimuli of the U.S. economy, take time to work their way through the system. There's sort of a first punch in terms of expectations on the part of investors. And then the real punch, depending on whether it's big or small, is actually motivated by how much dollars are flowing in and investments are actually made. So we need to unbundle the effects of these laws and looking at how the stimulus ultimately will be mediated in the economy.
Harry Broadman, it's good to have you with us. Thank you. That's former US Assistant Trade Representative and Chief of Staff at the US President's Council of Economic Advisers. Thank you.